Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends. It's a pleasure for me to be here and being able to open the 8th annual student conference of our Cold War History Research Center at Corvinus University of Budapest. I'm the director of this center. I'm actually the founding director of this center, and I'm running this center since 1999, and this is already becoming a very important workshop in the field of Cold War history, and we have been organizing these conferences since 2010 at the Corvinus University of Budapest. Last year we already had a kind of innovation because we joined forces with the European Institute at Columbia University in New York. And we are very glad to have the leader of the Radio Free Europe project here, Dr. PHILLIPS, who will chair this first panel today, who actually is taking care of the students from Columbia University who are doing research in Budapest before this conference, and then come to our conference to share their research results with us and with everybody else, as we can see, because this will be live broadcast. Last year, because of this cooperation, we had 6 Columbia students and 2 students from West Point Military Academy, also from the United States. This year, the cooperation even went further because we have maintained the cooperation with Columbia University and the European Institute at Columbia University and the West Point Military Academy. So we have the same number of 6 students from Columbia and 2 cadets, 2 students from West Point this year as well. However, there is even more striking or kind of very welcome cooperation in the making, because as you can see, this event takes place at the Central European University in Budapest, which is definitely a new development, and of course we are very happy and very glad to be able to have this conference here. And of course we are very thankful for the history department of Central European University, which made it possible to have this event in this brand new and fantastic super building. Again, not only Columbia and West Point students are representing foreign participants at this conference, but also 2 of Central European University's own students are also joining us. Plus, of course, there are many Hungarian participants from different universities, not only Corvinus, but other universities from Debrecen and Szeged and Pécs as well. And of course, we are very glad to have participants from foreign countries, like from Serbia, from Slovakia, Italy, and Poland at our conference this year. Also, let me draw your attention to our internship program, and please spread the word about the internship program of our center, which is in the making since 2009. And so far we had some more than 120 international interns coming to do internship work and research, real research, not copy making and coffee making, as it happens sometimes. Sorry for anybody else who would be concerned, but here really we are taking care of our students, and they are doing really serious research work. Because of this, actually, we are also very proud to be able to announce that from this year, 2017, our center has become an official internship partner of Oxford University, who actually will send 3 students this summer already for 2 months internship, paid by Oxford University, of course, because our internship programs, I haven't mentioned this, but this is also important, are of course unpaid, because we cannot afford paying our interns, but still, as you can see, like many students have come in the past years, and we very much hope that they will come in the future years as well. The other new element of this conference is the live broadcasting of the event, which is going on right now. And of course, this is not just live in the sense that you can see it now, and many other people all over the world can follow our conference right now. But of course, afterwards, this becomes a kind of video footage, so anybody can watch it afterwards as well. So if somebody, your friends, relatives, and colleagues and teachers haven't had the chance to watch it online, then they will have the chance to watch it later. Just like a YouTube video, this would be able to watch afterwards as well. And last but not least, of course, I am very glad to be able to be here at Central European University, and from this post actually to express our solidarity with the Central European University in their ongoing fight for survival in Budapest, which definitely that's what everybody wants, except for the government, but everybody wants in Hungary. And definitely our center has been expressing its utmost solidarity with the Central European University, and we very much hope that the ongoing negotiations which are taking place right now will lead to a satisfactory compromise, a satisfactory solution of the situation, so that the Central European University can remain and function in Budapest in the future years as well. So by this, let me stop the opening. The opening of the conference has been done, and let me give the floor over to Victoria Phillips, who is a lecturer at Columbia University at the History Department, and she will chair the first panel of Radio Free Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor BÉKÉS, and I thank Corvinus, of course, Central European University. I thank all of you for coming. Columbia University and the European Institute's Cultural Initiative is honored to be a part of this project, and we're honored to bring with us our cadets from West Point Military Academy. This has been an ongoing relationship between the Cultural Initiative at the European Institute and West Point Military Academy and members of the military in the United States. And this is a very important part of the Cultural Initiative because soft power oftentimes meets hard power, and we all have so much to learn from each other in these efforts. Just a brief word about the Radio Free Europe project. It began several years ago out of a conversation that I had with now Major Greg Tomlin, who was at the Pentagon. And he gave a presentation on Morrow and said after the presentation, oh yes, and then I made a radio station in the field. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And we got into a discussion about the importance of radio. In my course on cultural diplomacy, I noticed that the literature on Radio Free Europe was smallish, yet the documents were vast. Especially with Open Society archives here in Budapest, Stanford University, and everything from the Truman Archives to the Eisenhower Presidential Archives. Hence was born the Radio Free Europe project, which takes between 8 and 10 students a year to 3 archives to do primary research, to look at the documents, come up with new theories, and write based on archival projects. So you'll see some of these students here giving presentations. Please, many questions, because they are just seeing the documents, in some cases just this week, and in the process of formulating theses. So we appreciate all comments, and we start. Thank you.
I'm gonna need a primer on how to do this. And is it just perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Elena BURGER, and my presentation is Static on the Airwaves, Hungarian Radio Stations during the 1956 Hungarian Uprising. So when I began my research at the Open Society Archives last week, I was operating under the impression that Radio Free Europe was the major broadcaster to Hungarians during the 1956 uprising. But when I began coming across transcripts describing delayed bus schedules in Budapest or anti-Stalin humor in Győr, I began to realize that there were a whole number of regional radio stations that counted Hungarians as their audience. Now, these stations do have something in common. They were all monitored by RFE, and so by extension, they were monitored by the CIA. And there were a number of summaries that just described write-ups of their shows. This got me thinking, to what extent did these stations influence RFE during the 1956 uprising? And if RFE was monitoring them, presumably their opinions and coverage was influenced as well. So this sort of suggests the limits of soft power in two really key ways. The first is that, there is coverage and there is obviously news that comes regionally that isn't sort of deployed from the top or deployed from the United States. And it also suggests that, there's a lot of regional coverage that, that influenced RFE, which I'll go into later. So the stations essentially fall into two different categories. The regional stations, which in the words of RFE, provided information about the main centers of insurrection during the 1956 uprising. And then there were also state-sponsored stations like Radio Budapest. And you can this is an RFE document that sort of shows where a lot of the stations were located and shows very clearly that they were being monitored. This is from one of the documents that I found. So, regional radio stations were the voices of their local workers' councils and would broadcast their demands of Imre Nagy during the 1956 uprising. And as the uprising progressed, they would act as both a local mouthpiece and would convey their demands to RFE as well. So not only were they relaying information to listeners, but they were also communicating information to people at RFE, and they knew RFE would be listening. RFE also monitored Radio Budapest, which was state-sponsored, and actually on October 23rd, just to demonstrate sort of what a politically important site Radio Budapest was, students actually rioted inside the building and demanded that that demands about the future of the uprising be read on air. I was just talking about October 23rd, but the focus of my presentation will actually be on the events of November 4th, 1956. So why? Why am I choosing this date? So basically, this date gives a good sense of the dialogue between RFE and domestic Hungarian radios. Now, in this presentation, I can prove definitively that not only was RFE monitoring the broadcast of regional stations, but they at least in one instance relayed messages to the UN on behalf of regional stations, which is interesting because they're taking, information from people on the ground who aren't members of RFE, who are just relaying information. And what I found in my research, which is the focus for a lot of this presentation, was a transcript of every single regional station during the 1956 Hungarian uprising. So you have cities throughout Hungary, and you get sort of a ground view of what is actually going on a daily basis. So I chose November 4th just for the purposes of this presentation because it would be too much to take you through everything in 15 minutes. So I used this book, and then I also went back and found a lot of UN testimonies from broadcasters who were working at these stations at the time, who then the next year went to go and testify before the UN about the uprising. And so using this, I was able to create a really full picture of what was going on at the stations and also how these stations were then relaying information to RFE. So just going to give you a little walkthrough of November 4th. So the Soviet Union attacked Budapest and a number of other Hungarian cities. Kato replaces Nagy as the premier of Hungary. There were repeated radio broadcasts calling for Western help. And this is interesting because it coincides with RFE promising to help the Hungarians, which was a very, very controversial aspect of RFE coverage during this time. The Soviet-held radio stations order surrender of arms, the resumption of work, and you see this tension between stations that were initially held by Hungarians that then transitioned over to Soviet-held stations in this period. And then many free radio stations fall. Radio Free CROUSE goes off the air after broadcasting repeated SOS calls. So I'm looking at two examples of regional radio stations that broadcasted on November 4th. So Radio Free CROUSE and Radio Recoutsy. Both stations were included in the master RFE write-up that I found, and both stations had personnel who later testified before the UN Special Committee on the Problem of Hungary. So I'll start with Radio Free CROUSE, which, per the testimonies of Paul Mehrer, who testified before the UN, was on air from October 29th to November 4th. During this period, Paul Mehrer, who testified, said that the radio generally monitored reports coming in from rural areas, and reports from that period mainly dealt with the fact that a large number of Soviet troops were moving into the country and were occupying important railway centers and airfields. He said that he received thousands of questions from his audience members by telephone, cable, and telegram, and he said that everyone wanted to know the meaning of the large number of Russian troops coming into the country in the face of continued assurances from the Russian government that they were withdrawing their troops from Hungary. So you see that the radio served as a crucial broadcasting point for audience members listening. Thousands of people, per the testimonies of Paul Mehrer, called in. Now, the RFE transcripts of Radio Free CROUSE broadcast corroborate Mehrer's testimony. On November 4th in the morning, the station broadcasted a speech by Imre Nagy announcing that Soviet troops had attacked Budapest. At 6:12 in the morning, another announcement went on air. They said, "Attention, attention, important announcement. The Hungarian government appeals to the officers and men of the Soviet army not to shoot. Let us avoid bloodshed. The Russians are our friends and will remain our friends." Now, what's very interesting is that Paul Mehrer, who gave the UN testimony, said that that morning he had actually had an interaction with the Soviet commander, and he describes it as, he told us that as a soldier he was only carrying out orders. He asked us to refrain from military activity. The Russians behaved themselves quite well. Speaking in Hungarian, they reassured us that they would never fire upon us, let alone fight us. So you see sort of the event that led up to this broadcast, which is cool, I think. But things get a little bit dark because literally an hour and 12 minutes later, Radio Free CROUSE goes off the air with a repeated SOS signal. Then the station was silent until 8:15 p.m. And when the transmission returned, it was in the hands of the Soviet-controlled regime. So Radio Free Europe, we know, was clearly monitoring these events because it made it into the transcript. But this just shows that they were monitoring. Were they actually influencing their coverage? That's less conclusive in this case, but what we do know is that Paul Mehrer Paul Mehrer and Radio Free CROUSE was sort of the go-to point for thousands of people who were calling in asking for information. So it just goes to show the limits of Radio Free Europe soft power, which was not a station you could call into as an audience, versus these regional stations, which served as go-to points. So from the same UN hearing, though, that Paul Mehrer and Radio Free CROUSE were testifying in, we hear from an anonymous person who calls themselves Witness Q. And this man organized and directed Radio Free Recoutsy. So Witness Q was elected to the Revolutionary Workers' Council of Dunapatel, a city 50 kilometers south of Budapest. And at a meeting on October 30th, they elected to establish a free radio station. So what you see are radio stations sporadically coming up and people saying, okay, we need to broadcast, we need to get information out, this is how we're going to do it. So Witness Q said we were compelled to confine ourselves to broadcasting mainly news of the revolution owing to the difficulty of obtaining news of a general nature. On November 4th, we changed positions constantly, broadcasting from a transmitter installed in a bus, so that Russian tanks would not be able to zero in on our station and hit it. On November 4th, a group of Russian tanks drew up in front of us. The Russians stopped the trucks, which were carrying supplies to Budapest. The trucks as well as the supplies were stolen. I witnessed one such event. This happened many times, and the personnel of the trucks were shot in a ditch by the roadside. So these are all the testimonies for the UN of Witness Q. Now, what was the broadcast that Radio Free Europe picked up that morning? They said on air The fight against the intruder is raging everywhere. Hungarians, do not let the Russian troops carry out a massacre in our beloved country. Take your arms and stand for the sacred cause of the defense of the country. Death to the Soviet occupier. So this is not only showing that they're under direct siege, but it's also a call to arms to the listeners, which is something that Radio Free Europe was accused of. But you can also see that regional stations were doing it as well. Now, what's really interesting is in the afternoon, Radio Free Rákóczi asked for help from the UN in Hungarian, Italian, French, and German. In fact, they relayed a message to Radio Free Europe that Radio Free Europe then relayed to the UN, sent back confirmation, and then Radio Free Rákóczi actually thanked them on air. So we know that Radio Free Europe was taking information from these regional stations, relaying them to the UN, and broadcasting back. Now at 2:35 in the afternoon, Radio Rákóczi has one of its final broadcasts where they're asking for help directly from Radio Free Europe. So this raises a number of questions. What kind of help did these radio stations want? This isn't the only instance of people asking for help from Radio Free Europe. Did they want to be rebroadcasted, or did they want military help? So what does this dialogue indicate? Hungarians may have been responsible for overemphasizing the strength of Americans and the UN, and the hope that international aid might come. There's also a question, which is, why didn't witness Q, who was testifying before the UN, reference the fact that he had broadcasted to the UN on the day of November 4th? So these are questions that are just raised by, two broadcasts on one day. So there's also a second dynamic of the uprising, which comes when we look at instances when the Soviets were able to take control of Hungarian stations. Take, for example, Radio Szombathely, which was taken over the morning of November 4th, and Soviet broadcasters basically castigated Western capitalists and called and said that they could not succeed because the Hungarian workers and peasants reject the fascist dictatorship. Now, any RFE employees monitoring this would clearly be aware of the departure in tone from other Hungarian broadcasts and know that the station had been taken over by the Soviet Union. In fact, the RFE transcripts clearly indicate when the radios were in Soviet hands. But the idea that there were fascist counter-revolutionaries was a legitimate one during the uprising. In fact, this might have even prompted some of the hysteria that we saw from within RFE. So in a CIA post-mortem of the RFE broadcasts, the RFE political advisor, William Griffith, actually said that the most egregious reporting from RFE took place on November 4th. Now, November 4th is also the date when all of the stations begin to be taken over by Soviet broadcasters. So not only are you hearing that, oh, we're being invaded by the Soviet Union. No, you're hearing Soviet people on air broadcast to you from regional stations. This is this must have prompted a very visceral response. If you're aware, not only that, some remote location is being attacked by Soviets, but you can actually hear Soviets in your headpiece broadcasting to you, that must be a little bit triggering. So I don't want to relitigate the uprising and who's responsible and who's not, but that's just an interesting detail that I also want to explore more and see if there was sort of a response to the fact that there are actually Soviets on air. So my question while I was doing this is, why hadn't I heard about these regional stations before? I thought RFE, maybe this is like me being sort of naive and like, oh, America is the most important country in the world, but why hadn't I heard about these regional stations? I thought RFE was the only broadcaster. And so I felt back to some documents that I had actually found at the National Archives. And it was a survey conducted with Hungarian refugees in Austria from February 1957. And 96% of participants in the survey answered yes to the question, do you think Hungarian people expected aid from the West and the US in the uprising? So when you look at the breakdown actually of these responses, so 7% of the people said that RFE broadcasts were responsible for this thought, but 19% of people said that foreign broadcasts were responsible for this thought. So not necessarily RFE. And then when you look at the actual individual responses. Some of them point to encouragement by the radio. Various broadcasts constantly stir the population up, encouraging news the radio promised too much. So this doesn't necessarily mean RFE. This could be regional radio stations or the BBC, but from the transcripts that I was looking at, regional radio stations were incredibly encouraging and quite hysterical, probably justifiably, because they were under attack. So my takeaway questions. Do we need to include all radio stations, not just RFE, in our discussion of the Hungarian uprising? Was there a symbiotic relationship between RFE and domestic Hungarian stations? And in the CIA post-mortem of the RFE broadcasts, they cite the relatively safe tone of RFE broadcasters, but were domestic broadcasters too hysterical, too encouraging, or giving false hope about the potentials of RFE and the UN? So, thank you.
Yes, okay.
Okay. Hello, my name is Edward Krause, and I'm an undergraduate student in History and English Literature at Columbia University. And I will be presenting my research entitled, Again the Ghosts of Hungarian Patriots Rose in the Council Chamber to Haunt the Soviets, the United Nations Between Hungary and Suez. I would like to first thank Corvinus University and the Central European University for arranging and hosting this conference, and especially the Columbia European Institute for funding my research and travel as a Radio Free Europe Fellow. My presentation today looks at the United Nations through two interrelated focal points. One, as an examination of the United Nations' actions regarding the Hungarian Revolution and the Suez Crisis, and the other as an analysis of how the UN both used and was used by Cold War media. The two central questions regarding the formulation of my research were why Hungary and Suez, and why the UN and why broadcasting. At the initial stages of my research, I became drawn to this period in Cold War history given the simultaneous, even connected nature of the two events in November and October of 1956, especially as two interventions portrayed radically differently, one anti-Soviet and one anti-imperialist. I am particularly inspired by Peter Boyle's article, The Hungarian Revolution and the Suez Crisis, who in 2005 wrote that despite the prevalence of individual scholarship on Hungary and Suez, there's been relatively little published work, however, on the interconnection between these two episodes. As a Columbia University Radio Free Europe Fellow, I was able to spend a week in the Open Society archives here in Budapest researching the Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty Research Institute collection. And it was during this research that I found folders and boxes of documents RFE had written and collected about the United Nations regarding the Hungarian Revolution. This overarching project is exemplified by the following document I found, the testament of a Hungarian student in an RFE internal special report from November 27, 1956. It reads, a student wrote that he, like all Hungarians, listens to Radio Free Europe. He wrote that it would be much better if RFE did not mention the UN in its broadcast, since the UN is currently in very bad repute in Hungary. He pointed out that the UN has taken some action in the Middle East, but not in Hungary, where blood has been spilled in the cause of freedom. He said people do not believe that the Russians take the UN seriously. This concept is illustrated by the following drawing featured in the New York Times at the end of 1956, in which we can see the Soviet Union directing attention to Egypt and away from Hungary. The student's perception derives from the fact that the Suez Crisis and Hungarian Revolution occurred simultaneously. And while I'll describe this later on in detail, I wanted to preface now that my analysis will feature primarily the Hungarian Revolution more so than the Suez Crisis, simply because I found more of these related documents at the Open Society archives. I will cover first the relation between the United Nations and media in Hungary, and then examine the actions taken by the UN with respect to these two crises, which will form the foundation for an analysis of a rhetorical shift among Western powers at the UN. Okay. the principal reaction to the United Nations among media outlets of the Hungarian government was outrage over the organization's perceived interference in the country's internal matters. A background report compiled on September 7, 1957 for the RFE Evaluation and Research Section explained that the whole case rests on the argument that this is Hungary's own affair and that the UN has no competence to examine or discuss it at an ordinary or special session. This background research was conducted in the aftermath of a UN Special Committee report tasked with investigating the Hungarian uprising. In addition to refuting the basis itself for an investigative report, the government coverage challenged the findings within the report itself. RFE research explains that the UN report is dismissed as unreliable as it is based on anonymous and unreliable evidence, and that a counter-argument frequently used is that Soviet intervention took place at the request of the Hungarian government. The spokesman of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs went so far as to claim that Soviet intervention was made in accordance with the spirit of the UN Charter. Similarly, an RFE Hungarian press survey from August of the same year collected an anonymous Hungarian article from a pro-regime newspaper which criticized the UN investigation of Hungary as a distraction from other world affairs. It reads in an English translation provided by RFE that, aside from the general attack on the Soviets, the other purpose of this hastily gathered assembly, to which large-scale publicity is given, is to divert attention from the crimes committed in Algeria, Oman, and Cyprus from the Hungarian perspective by the Western imperialists. And just as the regime media in Hungary denounced UN attempts to condemn and interfere in the political situation in Hungary, the Hungarian delegation at the UN attacked Radio Free Europe as the instigator of the Hungarian Revolution, a narrative used elsewhere by the government in this period. For example, on December 8, 1959, at the UN's 14th session, the head of the Hungarian delegation, János Péter, prepared a speech in which he wrote that the so-called Radio Free Europe, with its representatives and relay stations on the spot, acted as a sort of military headquarters giving detailed instructions. Radio Free Europe, in return, also treated the UN as an important element of the Hungarian Revolution. Documents within the folders at the Open Society archives on the UN discussion of the Hungarian uprising suggest that certain elements within Radio Free Europe during this period had a positive perception of the organization. For example, guidance notes from the RFE New York Director's Office in July of 1960 write that the US has done everything possible to support the constructive program of the UN, thus portraying the UN in a positive and collaborative tone. Likewise, in that same year, RFE special report sent to the radio desk in Hungary of 1960, entitled Hungary Shuns UN Day Concert, points out that it is generally assumed that the coincidence of the UN's official 15th birthday with the 4th anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution prompted the Budapest radio not to join in with the other 79 countries throughout the world. The report then provides that the Hungarian listeners would have heard the musical message of enormous confession of faith in the victorious human spirit and in human brotherhood. Thus, this report suggests that that RFE had interest in the potential usage of the UN here with this concert as a means of countering government media and censorship. However, this utilization of the UN by RFE could sometimes go too far, such as the testament I provided earlier of a Hungarian student complaining about the prevalence of the UN in RFE broadcasting, given the fact that the UN was dealing more with Suez than Hungary during 1956. And to understand this frustration, we have to look at the respective actions taken by the UN in Suez and Hungary. So I have here a preliminary timeline of November 1st, 1956, during the height of both crises, when Nagy appeals to the UN to defend Hungarian neutrality on November 1st, 1956, before the November 4th that Elena was talking about. The UN had already convened its first ever emergency special session on November 1st to discuss the Suez crisis. And in this special session for the Suez crisis, they passed 3 notable resolutions. The first, on the first day of this session, in which it called for the withdrawal of Israel in Suez. 3 days later, a second resolution proposing the creation of a peacekeeping force, which remains today. And in the third resolution on November 6th, the resolution created the peacekeeping force and established a line of intervention of the UN into the Suez zone. Meanwhile, Naj's appeal was finally taken up a couple days later, and its special emergency session was convened during the same time that the special session on Suez happened, which kind of shows the split resources that the UN had at the time. And in this special session devoted to Hungary, only 2 resolutions were passed. The first on November 4th, which called for the withdrawal of the USSR in Hungary, and the second towards the last day of the session, which was largely just a repetition of this resolution. Over the following years, Hungary, the UN continued to consider the Hungarian issue, including creating a special committee and establishing Sir Leslie Munro's report on the Hungarian uprising. However, it was ultimately dropped by 1963 as enough time had passed that it would not have made sense for the UN to intervene in Hungary, especially given the fact that the USSR opposed such matters both within the Security Council and within the General Assembly at large. However, within these actions and resolutions of the UN's response to the Hungarian Revolution, I've detected a rhetorical shift from its beginning in 1956 to when the issue was ultimately dropped in 1963. In the immediate aftermath of the uprising in the following years, the rhetoric within the UN from the Western powers tended to reflect a generalized anti-Soviet position which denounced the country's suppression and disregard of Hungarian national sovereignty and of the UN Charter with respect to its intervention. For example, in September of 1960, U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge was reported by Reuters as saying, "We wish with all our hearts that the Hungarian people had been allowed to carry on in their own affairs in freedom and quietness, according to the standards of the Charter and of common decency. But that was not to be. The suffering and suppressed people of Hungary have no free voice, since Moscow has taken that away from them." Only months after this statement, however, and following the delivery of Sir Leslie Munro's Special Committee report, the UN began to shift its focus away from the Hungarian issue. The Times in London reported that at the end of 1960, the Assembly is now engaged in a long debate on colonialism, with many propaganda speech by the communists and their friends. 2 years later, an RFE special report writes that the United Nations British delegation said that the Soviet Union should follow the British example and free some of its own dependent territories. And as Britain had proceeded swiftly and continuously since 1945 to liquidate its empire, and we, the British delegation, urged the Soviet government to continue to examine its own record before it criticizes ours. The British and Commonwealth delegations continued to make comparisons between the supposedly swift British decolonization taking place in the early 60s to the ever-increasing communist colonialism. This, however, poses an interesting contrast with the comparative study of 1956 of the Hungarian Revolution and the Suez Crisis, given Britain's actions within the Suez Crisis being denounced on the world stage for its perceived imperialist aggressions. And this begs the question, why such a shift in the rhetoric? I think there are 2 principal causes. I think one has to do with a simple chronology. As Britain and other Western powers do partake in decolonization movements in the early 60s, this type of decolonial rhetoric was already in use and in debate at the UN, and thus provided an easy rhetorical standpoint from which to critique the USSR, especially given the challenges within the UN of litigating Warsaw Pact and Soviet issues, given that they were not normally considered colonial matters. And so if Western powers were able to successfully shift the focus on a type of communist colonialism, the thinking was that it would be easier for the UN to deal with such matters. I think another explanation, a little less immediately evident, is that there was certainly a need for a hesitance on behalf of the Western powers, especially Britain in the late 50s, to use this terminology of communist colonialism to avoid a sense of hypocrisy if Britain is denouncing Soviet imperialism during 1950s regarding the Hungarian Revolution at the same time that Britain is itself sending in military into Egypt to retake a canal. What sort of ideological standpoint would this show on Britain during this time? So that is one of the conclusions that I have taken away from my research, but I've also highlighted 3 other extensions that present themselves and that I would be interested in exploring. The second is the concept of crisis and its evocation. If we go back to my title quote about the ghosts of Hungarian patriots haunting the Soviets in the Security Council, that's in reference to another Henry Cabot Lodge speech at the UN in which several years after the fact, to discuss issues in Cuba, he again references the Hungarian Revolution as another point in which the USSR has intervened and suppressed other nations. And I think we can see that in this situation, the crisis of the Hungarian Revolution was easily marketable as a type of attack that Western powers could use against the Soviets. However, as a crisis, it was something that the UN was not able to resolve, which shows the paradoxical nature of a crisis as difficult to deal with within the UN, but easy to bring up just for rhetorical purposes. The third extension that I would like to look at kind of goes back to my initial research probing, which is the role of Britain and the BBC in the Hungarian Revolution compared to the United States and Radio Free Europe during this period. Especially, I've been interested in the idea of the 2 events as anti-communist and anti-imperialist, and the way that the 2 different broadcasting corporations, the BBC and Radio Free Europe, examine these 2 events as Britain and the United States were on both the same and opposing sides, respectively, with these 2 crises. And the final point that I would like to research further at some point is a more comprehensive study of the relation between Radio Free Europe and the UN. What was the overall reception of the UN within Radio Free Europe broadcasting? Was it treated simply as an extension of the US? Was it always considered this constructive program that it described in 1960? Or did it also become viewed as an ineffective bureaucracy? To what extent was RFE treatment of the UN uniform across the different services, or did it differ drastically from country to country or from reporter to reporter? So, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. To everyone, I'd like to echo thanks that everyone has already given to Corvinus University for hosting us, or to the Central European University for hosting us. And of course, a very personal thanks for me to Dr. Phillips and to Dr. BÉKÉS, who have both been very, very influential in my formation as a grad student this past year. My name is Giancarlo MILEA. And I am an MA student at Columbia. I will be presenting today. My title has changed a little bit. That's kind of the product of a new week of research. But now, tentatively, it is the Philharmonia Hungarica, Folk Music and Cold War Cultural Politics after the Hungarian Uprising from 1957 to 1972. Okay, so I'll first kind of offer an organization of what I'll be talking about. I'd like to start by laying out my thesis, so that you guys can kind of follow along. And then I'll offer a brief institutional history of the Philharmonia Hungarica, which was an orchestra comprised entirely of Hungarian refugees fleeing, and that was primarily based in Vienna during this period. Then I'd like to look at some of my findings from this week and talk about kind of a changing cultural Cold War, and even perhaps lay the seeds for an idea of this era as kind of a proto-détente, as like a cultural détente that predates the 1959 Cultural Pact between the United States and the Soviet Union. And then finally, I'd like to wrestle with this idea of folk and this idea of the modernization of folk and its role in this period, because it is very important. For my purposes, my RFE documents primarily dealt with not so much transcripts or broadcasts as it did with research and information gathering by RFE. Okay, so my thesis, I'll break it down for everyone. The brief prominence of the Philharmonia Hungarica from 1957 to 1960 clashed with concurrently emerging overtones of cultural détente that predated the 1959 Cultural Pact between the United States and the Soviet Union. Folk music, particularly the work of Béla Bartók and Zoltán Koldai, played an important role in defining these relations, as officials in both Hungary and the United States attempted to appropriate these composers' modernist adaptations of folk for their purposes with decidedly differing intentions. While some parts of the complex American cultural diplomacy apparatus did not observe those shifts in cultural diplomacy between East and West, Radio Free Europe officials seem to have had access to research materials that would have allowed them to foresee those changes, and thus they did not devote significant effort to promoting the Philharmonia Hungarica. Okay. So the Philharmonia Hungarica very much began as a product of the Ford Foundation, actually, which had sent officials to the refugee camps in Vienna to kind of assess, and outside Vienna to assess the problem of the gathering Hungarian refugees in Austria. Right? It was decided very quickly that it was particularly important to resettle intellectual refugees or cultural elites, because these people were considered the spirit of the revolution, is what comes up in the documents. And there was concern that a lethargic Western attempt to integrate these people into Western society could lead to some disillusionment among those people credited as being kind of the vanguards of the revolution, and could even lead to their radicalization and their kind of redefection back to the East, and their kind of decision that maybe some of the propaganda they had heard in the East was actually correct. So by February 15th, 1957, not even 6 months after the crisis, the Ford Foundation approves about $100,000 or so to these kinds of resettlement projects for intellectuals and cultural elites. And one of these projects is the Philharmonia Hungarica. And rehearsals begin soon after that. It's a very quick turnaround. By May, they're already playing in concerts. And their first one is in Vienna. And their program is very particularly chosen. Now, I couldn't find particularly what pieces they played per se, or a program per se in the documents. But the critics who write reviews for the orchestra, which we'll get into a little bit later, really highlight the fact that they are playing Bartók and Koldai and Berlioz, who is admittedly Western European, but his Rákosi March is very much connected to this kind of political and really philosophically Hungarian essence, so to say. What did I do? Oh, there we go. Okay. So that's very significant, and we'll see one review in a second. By September, they're playing. By September of the following year, they're playing at the American Pavilion at the Brussels World's Fair, which I think kind of demonstrates or kind of encapsulates what they were. They were kind of this American propaganda tool that was kind of used as a Cold War weapon in what was very much a Cold War arena at the Brussels World's Fair. By 1959, they went on a North American tour to Canada and the United States, coverage of which we'll get into in a second, because that's very important in assessing what conclusions American officials drew about them. And finally, in an effort to become financially solvent, they settled in Marl in West Germany as the kind of regional or municipal orchestra in that town, where they stayed until they were dissolved in 2001. Okay. So this is the American public diplomacy apparatus that I referenced in my thesis. And I, in part, put it up here just because I think the visual connotes how confusing it is and how kind of Byzantine it is. But for our purposes, I'd like to focus kind of on this triangle right here. So as we can see, Ford Foundation funding founded the Philharmonia Hungarica, and the organizational effort was very much undertaken by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Radio Free Europe had a relationship with the Philharmonia Hungarica. It's not that they didn't have a relationship, but as we'll see, the vastness and the different bodies that comprise this apparatus all had very different intentions with regards to the orchestra. And we'll see that those clash, and that Radio Free Europe very much kind of removes itself from kind of this propaganda ploy. Okay, so this is a review from in the Times of London on the orchestra. And we see that it's very enthusiastic. You can read the quote on the side. But it's enthusiastic not for reasons that a music critic should be enthusiastic, right? They reference very bluntly that there were kind of minor slips in the orchestra that, you know, they were good and they were exciting, but they weren't great, right? This wasn't like a stellar performance per se. But what really brought the crowd to its feet and what made them chant for an encore was the patriotic significance of the orchestra, what it represented, right? So when it comes to doing cultural diplomacy, that's not such a great tool, right? You want to promote your best. You want the performances that you give to be the very best. And while political optics are certainly important, it's not so much important if your quality is kind of dipping. So the first part of this, of why Radio Free Europe might not have used the Philharmonia Hungarica per se, is that the quality was not as good, and the political optics were kind of significant, but secondary to the quality. Radio Free Europe did have a relationship with the orchestra at the outset. They actually recorded the first concert. And this is a letter from Michael Josselson, who was the executive secretary in the Congress for Cultural Freedom, writing to Shepard Stone, who was the director of the Ford Foundation's International Affairs Program. And in the letter, I think it's kind of comical, which is why I put it up there, in part. But in the letter, Michael Josselson complains that RFE essentially charged too much money for its recording of the orchestra's first concert, and says that he actually turned them down again for recording the second concert. Now, why this is funny and why this is significant is that if we go back for a second to our apparatus, we see that the Central Intelligence Agency is funding both the Congress for Cultural Freedom and Radio Free Europe, which are the two entities that are complaining that they don't have enough money. And to kind of add another kind of chink in the chain, Michael Josselson is himself a CIA agent. So it's very kind of funny and weird that he's going through official channels to get funding. Not unheard of, but certainly it seems like a quick call to Langley could have solved his problems without having to bother Shepard Stone. Okay. Radio Free Europe also did a fair amount of reconnaissance and kind of trying to understand, based on their sources on the ground, the effects of these exiles and of this kind of dearth of musicianship in Budapest. And what we see is that by 1961, one research memorandum includes the fact that while there was a mass exodus of musicians leaving for Austria, by 1961, enrollment in the Philharmonic Orchestra in Budapest, for young musicians particularly, had tightened up. It was not as easy for these younger musicians to get into the orchestra, which would suggest that the quality, even though it may have suffered at the beginning of in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, by 1961, this Philharmonic Orchestra in Budapest had really climbed back to its former heights, right? And that there was kind of this return to a kind of normal elite level of musicianship. So the second part of this is not only that the Philharmonia Hungarica was not as good, but that the cultural export from Budapest was actually better, right? So it's not a great way to combat this kind of communism for Radio Free Europe. Additionally, in 1957, there really is a kind of changing cultural Cold War. Professor Joseph Bognar, someone I found in the archive, an economist and the president of the Hungarian Institute for Cultural Relations, is already authoring articles in the Hungarian press calling for, among other things, trade between the East and West, and for kind of expanding Hungary's cultural tourism. I've included some of his articles up there. Additionally, there is an extensive spread of Hungarian folk music and classical music in the immediate period following the revolution. Hungarian orchestras go all over Western Europe, Hungarian dancers and the like, and quartets playing Bartók and Koldai, these people that the Philharmonia Hungarica was very much trying to appropriate as their own, right? Not only, though, are the Hungarians going to Western Europe, but former Hungarians are coming back into Hungary, including Yudi Menuhin, who is a famous violinist who is not Hungarian, but who played with the Philharmonia Hungarica and did several performances in Budapest after playing with the orchestra. Antal Dorati, who was the conductor, among other places, of the Minneapolis Philharmonic Orchestra, and also conducted the Philharmonia Hungarica, went back to Hungary and actually received the Bartók Pásztory Award in 1981 for his, which is kind of offered to a Hungarian musician of merit annually. So there really is this kind of exchange going on back and forth in Hungary, even with people associated with the orchestra that presumes to represent the free Hungary, that should not be kind of associating with the regime. All right? Nevertheless, there is a difficulty in remembering the Hungarian uprising for both American and Hungarian officials, which I think is worth mentioning. Ross Johnson and others have talked about how American officials remembering the Hungarian uprising, it's a little tough for them because America made some promises that, or American officials made promises that they couldn't necessarily keep. But for Hungarian officials too, for obvious reasons, this was very much suppressed, and that's very clear in the documents. Perhaps one really interesting piece is that I managed to find Antal Dorati's obituaries in the archive, and his English one references that he was a conductor of the Philharmonia Hungarica. His Hungarian one does not. His Hungarian one very clearly leaves that out, and he died in the 80s. So I think we can draw certain conclusions about the regime's attempt to kind of erase this or kind of drown it out in kind of superior classical music emanating from Budapest itself, rather than coming in from the West. Finally, the Cold War progresses. The Cold War moves on. A lot of these officials kind of get restless, having to kind of deal with this Hungarian refugee crisis, which we'll see in a second. But two kind of events, the Berlin crisis in 1958 and the Cultural Pact between the US and the Soviet Union, very much kind of lead officials to keep Hungary, kind of to leave Hungary behind a little bit, to leave the Hungarian refugee crisis behind. So there are muddled American conclusions about the Philharmonia Hungarica that I think are worth exploring. On the one hand, Hungarian listenership of at least the VOA actually has some good things to say about broadcasts relating to the orchestra. One review calls it one broadcast very good and interesting because it lets Hungarians know how much Americans appreciate the titans of their musical canon, right? And that's important, and that's a good thing for the United States to know. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily get received by American officials. The apparatus really does break down. The Ford Foundation can't justify continuing to fund this orchestra that can't get financially solvent, in Vienna at least. The logistics break down as well. The State Department encourages the Ford Foundation to keep up the funding, but won't help in any kind of concrete way. The military is also consulted, but they also reject using the Air Force to airlift musicians and kind of clunky instruments in and out of concert venues. And finally, the purpose of the orchestra kind of gets lost. And we can see that in this quote from a note to Shepherdstone, from Shepherdstone to Nicholas Nabokov, in which he says, in the wake of the Berlin crisis, that perhaps, given that they are trying to settle the orchestra in Germany, maybe we could include some of those East German refugees in our free Hungarian orchestra, which would render your Hungarian refugee orchestra just a refugee orchestra, right? And it doesn't really make sense that, an East German violinist would be playing Bartók. Like, not to say that, they can't appreciate Bartók, but it loses the kind of political significance, and it really just becomes kind of a clumsy Cold War propaganda tool, rather than something for which Hungarians can take potential pride in. Thank you. Okay. So I'd just like to briefly talk about Hungarian folk and the importance of folk music in the East, and I'll try to truncate this a little bit. But from the socialist side, from the communist side, folk plays an unpredictably important role, or at least it was unpredictable for me. Certain communist officials very much discuss folk in a kind of Gramscian sense, in the sense that folk is a way to kind of codify and to articulate the way people behave, the way people think, their habits, and all of that. So modernizing folk, modernizing the peasant, the culture of the peasantry, the culture of the kind of lingering bourgeois presence, would kind of socialize them in a way, right? Which is, again, reflected in the work of Antonio Gramsci and other communist writers. But so there's very much an attempt by the regime to kind of co-opt Béla Bartók, who was kind of a Hungarian composer, but who kind of gathered Eastern European sounds and folk music and used them in his work. There was kind of an effort by the regime to make him as much a friend of the Soviet Union as possible, as much a friend of socialism as possible, even though he emigrated to the United States before the war and died in 1945 there, and really didn't have that much of a relationship with communism. Nevertheless, Zoltán Koldai, who was a Hungarian composer and very much beloved in Hungary, and a music teacher, actually kind of went off and did his own thing against the regime a little bit, and kind of helped to stoke these overtones of cultural détente. In a speech where he, at a ceremony where he received an honorary degree, he talked about actually how American folk music, he gave this huge compliment to American folk music that we can see here, that American folk music is the best in the world because the country is so young and so vibrant. And very much folk in the West, whereas in the East it talks about modernizing and changing people, the rhetoric that I found in the West is very much that you can share your past and your present at the same time if you kind of play these kinds of modernizing folk pieces. And that you can show a kind of progression of your society while maintaining a respect for your tradition. Okay, so there were, so essentially there were many reasons why the Philharmonia Hungarica was not necessarily broadcast on RFE as much, but I would very much appreciate your questions, and I thank you for listening. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Thank you all so much for your presentations. We have a special guest presentation. It's my honor to introduce Callie Peace from West Point Military Academy, who is going to be briefly presenting on her project that, interestingly enough, relies on several other presentations that will be given by Sarah Roth and David Noel. With that.
Hello, as Dr. Phillips just mentioned, my name is Callie Peace, and I'm a cadet at the United States Military Academy at West Point. I would like to thank all of you for coming here today to hear the work myself and my colleagues have worked on this past week. And I'm sure you're eager to hear the variety of the topics we have to offer. My topic specifically focused on religion and how it was used as a method of resistance against the Soviet communist regime after World War II, leading up to the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. However, my time is apparently running short, so I will present to you a method of spreading freedom of religion throughout Eastern Europe following the invasion of the Soviet regime, which was Bible balloons. To aid you in creating a mental image, since I don't have a presentation, these were helium balloons that were cylindrical in shape and large enough to withstand the weight of a small Bible wrapped in a cellophane bag. So I would also like to mention, as Dr. Phillips said, that my colleague Sarah Roth will be presenting later on a similar topic explaining the significance of communication methods to Eastern European nations during this time period, as well as my colleague David Noel, who will be presenting on the importance of religious identity in Eastern Europe leading up to the Hungarian Revolution. Both of these topics will aid my presentation, so if you have time, please come listen to them later. The balloons themselves were intended to evoke disquiet and give the impression that the freedom of religion did not exist in Eastern Europe. The World Association of Evangelical Churches dispatched several thousand balloons carrying literature of religious content from the Bavarian borders to the Soviet-controlled nations in Eastern Europe. Each individual balloon had an Old Testament Bible that was tied to the string, and each Bible was wrapped in a cellophane bag for protection. Due to the diversity within Eastern European nations, the Bibles were written in Czech, Russian, and Polish. The attack, this was seen as an airstrike attack, and it was fairly complex, taking into account the weather conditions across a wide scope of airspace, as well as the physical aspect of each individual balloon. However, there were multiple times this type of attack was utilized during the Cold War. At first, the United Nations funded the project for 113,000 Bibles to be dropped from airspace into Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet-controlled region of Austria. According to the International Council of Christian Churches, Soviet soldiers were ordered to shoot down any foreign assets continuing into Russian airspace, to include these balloons. Although this was the only alternative the Soviet army had to counterattack the balloons, the Bibles would still end up falling to the ground, and that would allow the civilians of those nations to retrieve those Bibles before the Soviet army could have time to find them and retrieve them and dispose of them. So it was still effective regardless of whether they were shot down or not. In order to ensure most of the Bibles made it behind the Iron Curtain, the balloons were launched at night, which made it more difficult for the Soviets to shoot down and retrieve the literature. Because this had such a high success rate in the Soviet satellite nations, similar offensives were used in the following years. Specifically, I have an example from November 21st in 1982. An airstrike hit Moscow with a barrage of Bibles using similar tactics, those balloons. Approximately 13,500 Bibles, all of which were Russian text, were dropped into the city of Moscow by approximately 700 balloons. Being 9 feet long and cylindrical, these balloons were designed to be more accurate as they traveled from Finland into the suburbs of Moscow. This attack was mainly funded by the United Nations in an attempt to provide Bibles to the Russian population that actually highly demanded them regardless of the Soviet communist regime. The evolution of strategy used to launch the balloons, for example, how the balloons were launched in sets of 20 to 30 in order to resemble flocks of birds, symbolically ties to the evolution of independent nations resisting the Soviet regime to the international coalition uniting to expand freedom of religion in these nations. So, although that's only a small fraction of what those brave men and women did to fight for what they believed in, what they were built on in their religious persecutions and whatnot, their spiritual faith, I hope to have expanded your individual knowledge on what I found to be an intriguing topic about religion, acting as a unifying factor both behind and beyond the Iron Curtain. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for supporting the Central European University and Radio Free Europe conference my colleagues and I prepared for you today.
Thank you all so much. I think, you think about the propaganda effect of seeing the Soviets shooting at Bibles. I mean, even the defense is good propaganda. So it's really fascinating. I'm not going to take a very small amount of time because I want to hear your questions, and I have the distinct luxury of being able to work with all of these students in the future. One of the things that I just wanted to bring up was the new entrant of the UN. I don't think we hear about that a lot when we read about Radio Free Europe. I think this is a very important thing. And also, of course, the British. Where are the British in this story? It's so much we see a bipolar Cold War. And then the language of colonialism, again, that brings in the British. When we unpack these projects, when we're looking at radio, what's so important is the distillation of the content, right? What's being said, not just that it's being said or that it's being jammed. And here, I think we've got some real things to unlock. The power of folk. When you go deeper in, what exactly was played? What exactly was said? What did programming look like? And also the power of folk merges into this idea of a triumph over colonialism. Each region can return home in a sense, a kind of versus an imperialist whitewash either by the Soviet or the US. Yet both the Soviets and the United States governments used folk, or I should say both Moscow and the United States used folk to show respect for sovereignty within either their nation or their satellite countries. Yet there was this idea of modernizing it in the U.S. With new compositions. So I think it's real. There are so many different things to unpack here, and I'm going to leave that for now and ask for questions from the audience.
Yes, but unfortunately our time is up, and
oh, it's up completely?
we should leave the discussion to the afternoon when we have another session about Radio Free Europe, and we have a discussion section for that. So I suggest that we stop here, because actually we have to move to the other room for the keynote speech, and we have to have a little break as well. So let's stop here and then continue the discussion in the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.